Welcome. Welcome to the first Positive Links speaker series session of the academic year. Yes, thank you. I especially want you all to give a round of applause for the 200 or so people who are in the room, to the 800 or so people who are joining us online. Please say hello to each other. Now, whether you're joining us online on the live stream or you're here in the room, welcome. We are so glad that you're here. This session is hosted by the Center for Positive Organizations at the Michigan Ross School of Business. I'm Monica Warline, Faculty Director of the Center, and it's my pleasure to introduce you today to two fabulous people who are going to have us enwrapped in an onstage conversation. Before I do that, I want to thank some important sponsors, including the Sanger Leadership Center, the Tauber Institute for Global Operations, and the Samuel Zell and Robert H. Lurie Institute for Entrepreneurial Studies. They help make this series possible. Please thank them. And also, for helping get the word out, Ann Arbor Spark and the Managerial and Organizational Cognition Division of the Academy of Management, thank you so much for spreading the word. And if you enjoy this series and you have an organization that you think would like help spread the word, please reach out to us. We would love to draw larger and larger audiences for these science-based conversations. So, let's get to it. I have the privilege of calling these two people colleagues in the broader academic academy, and it truly is a privilege because Jamil Zaki, professor of psychology at Stanford University, is one of the world's leading thinkers on empathy and human connection. He is a brilliant researcher, but as you will discover when you read the book, if you haven't yet, he's also a brilliant writer. And I was telling him earlier today that I had a chance to see him many years ago, before this book was a twinkle in his eye, give a talk to a room full of scientists about the importance and power of making science accessible to the public. And I have known ever since that moment that this book was coming in some form or another, and we as a society are so lucky that it did. So I want to tell you, Hope for Cynics is on sale today at Amazon, 25% off. So if you didn't bring your copy with you today, you can find one there and get it. And in conversation with Jamil is another rock star scientist. Here, our very own University of Michigan professor of psychology and professor of business, Ethan Kross, is the author of a best-selling book, I hope you've read it, called Chatter. And coming in February, another, I predict, best-selling book called Shift, Managing Your Emotions So They Don't Manage You, which I really need to read. So, Ethan, Jamil, thank you so much for being here today. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Monica, for that wonderful introduction. And Jamil, thank you for being here. This is your first time in Ann Arbor. How is that possible? Is that true?
It's somehow true. I hope it's not my last time here. This is just a beautiful place, and I assume the weather is this good all year round, right? Very steady. Constant?
It just gets better.
Yeah, great.
It just gets better.
Incredible. Literally non-credible.
We're going to talk about credibility in a little bit. So one thing we need to share with everyone who is here, as well as the folks who are tuning in, this is not the first time we've met. We have known each other for 25 years. So Jamil and I overlapped in graduate school, which means that during the Q&A, we can really get real about Jamil, if you would like.
Or Ethan.
That is not true. But this book, which I devoured several times, as you know. I was fortunate to read early drafts, comment on them, and then also see the finished product. For someone like yourself that I know so well, I actually found it really surprising the first time I read it. I don't want to say I felt betrayed when I read it, but close to it, and I'll tell you why, and it will segue into our first question. Doesn't this gentleman look like a smiley, happy person here? Yeah. And I've always known you to be just Mr. Sunshine. And yet, you have this pretty personal confession that you make early on in this book that you have been struggling with cynicism for a really long time. And so I have so much that I want to explore on this issue. And I thought I would just start with, where does this come from, this state of mind that you've been carrying with you, really, I think, in silence for several decades?
Yeah, and I assume you'll invoice me for this therapy session later on, right? I'll tell you all about my parents.
Depends on how revealing you are.
Yeah. No, you raise a good point, and I think that I knew when I wrote this book that it would surprise a lot of people in my life. You're right. I've studied the science of kindness, compassion, as you were saying, Monica, and empathy for 20 years now. And I think that there's this stereotype of psychologists that, we say research is me-search. And there's this stereotype that whatever you do, you must also be in a certain way, that you must live the principles that you study. And that's just not always true. Understanding something is not the same as feeling it. And in fact, sometimes I think people go into studying things not because it's easy for them to access those parts of human life, but because it's hard. And so for me, yeah, as you said, it turns out that I've been pretty cynical my entire life. And a lot of that comes from my early childhood. My parents, two wonderful people, immigrants from different countries, just had a really hard time with each other. I kind of don't ever remember them getting along, and they started getting divorced when I was 8, but they didn't finish until I was 12, and a lot of my childhood was bound up as their only child in just managing a pretty chaotic household. And I think from that early experience, and I'm not the only one, I think a lot of people who are quote-unquote insecurely attached end up having a hard time trusting others. And so I think that I had this idea, it's not even an idea, more an instinct since early in my life, that I kind of had to be pleasant to be around in order for my life to be stable. And so you're right. I mean, I think that I'm trying not to smile too much now because I feel like that's just, I'm saying that it's inauthentic, but I am happy to be here. But I think a lot of the times, I and many other people have felt that we have to be pleasant and positive, but underneath that positivity is actually a surprisingly low expectation of others, that they will only be there for us if we are fun to be around.
I'm so curious now as to how long it took you to trust me, but you don't have to answer that question. So that sounds to me like it must have been like pretty effortful to carry that weight around you, where to the external world you're happy, you're smiley Jamil, but on the underneath the surface you're constantly questioning everything and everyone. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, and again, I don't think I'm the only person who experiences some difference between the self that they're trying to present to the world and their inner self. But the bigger that distance is, I think the more exhausting the labor is to sort of create that presentation. And there have always been people who I felt very close to. And one indication that you're really close to me, or at least this has been true in the past, one indication that you're really close to me is that I'm more negative around you. So if you want to know, Ethan, probably whenever I started complaining about everything, that's when I really felt like you saw me.
I did wonder why it has just gone so dark lately.
Around 2007, yeah.
Yeah. So, fast forward to the early 2020s, you decide to really start doing something about this discrepancy that exists personally, right, between the world and how you appear to it and how you feel on the inside. And there are a couple of stories that you tell in the book about what triggered this. COVID was one, but you also talk about someone we both knew, Emil. Mm-hmm. And I'd love, if it's okay, I know this is a deeply personal issue, but I'd love if you would just share with everyone here today who Emil was, what he personified, and how he really inadvertently led you to change your life.
Yeah. Emil was a colleague, a friend, but also one of my heroes. He also happened to get his PhD in molecular neuroscience here at Michigan.
As have most wonderful
Yes,
academics.
The best people all have been here. Or are here. Emil was a peace neuroscientist. A lot of people don't even know that's a job you can do, but he used tools from cognitive neuroscience to understand why people fall into hatred and conflict and division, and then tried to use that same science to pioneer new methods for conflict resolution, to allow people to rehumanize the person on the other side of a disagreement or conflict. One thing about Emil, though, was that he really was positive. In fact, he was so positive that I thought at first, game recognized game, you must be faking it too, right? But it turns out that he was not. He actually was genuinely oriented towards the best in people, which seemed a little bit ridiculous if you think about what he did. I mean, this is a guy who spent his time with members of hate groups. He would travel to places where there was violent conflict, and he saw hatred up close on, I think, 5 continents. So seeing his positivity, you kind of wondered, well, is he sheltered? What's going on with him? And I know I'm not the only person who wondered that about Emil, but then I interviewed him for my first book and learned all about his childhood and found out that his hope in people, his faith in people, was anything but naive. So shortly after Emil was born, his mother, Linda, developed severe schizophrenia. So debilitating that she was unable to raise him. She lived unhoused in the Palo Alto area for years. And so his childhood was extraordinarily tumultuous and difficult. But he remembers Linda not as somebody who he couldn't count on, actually quite the opposite. The way that he remembers it, even through her immense struggles, she found ways to be kind to him. She never yelled at him, never uttered a cruel word. The way that he put it was that she walked through darkness and gave him light. And when he was an adolescent, he decided that he would try to live in the same way, very intentionally, that whatever adversity he faced, he would try to turn it into positivity, ways of helping other people. I mean, he was one of the people with the greatest integrity I've ever known. And that same hope of his was tested again later. In 2018, he was diagnosed with glioblastoma, a very aggressive form of brain cancer that would take his life 2 years later on September 30th of 2020. And, he told me, I called him, and I remember within 5 minutes in this conversation, he was consoling me. It's like, what is happening here? He said, I know that I don't have as long to live as I thought I did, but if you think in ecological time, none of us have that long. And what I can do now is be as intentional with the rest of my life as I can be. And he did. He lived that way, convening scientists and peacemakers and writing and speaking. He continued to spread his message as best he could. And in my book, I try to just do a little bit more of that. I try to present who Emil was, his story, and his ideas. And if I can get 0.1% of Emil's philosophy into the world, it would be a huge success.
I mean, what a powerful reframe when you're at your absolute worst to just change the lens. Did that have an immediate effect on you in that moment, or did it take time to percolate in a way that ultimately led to this book?
It took a lot of time. I mean, the first line of the book is, I was always jealous of Emil Brunau, and that's true. And it's incredible because I think that here's a person who faced such adversity at the beginning and end of his life, but the way that he faced it was so inspiring, and it made me feel like I was failing at something, right? I mean, he was a terrible person to compare yourself to in any respect, a beautiful person, inside and out, but I know that's not what he would have wanted, right? I mean, he wanted not to make us all feel demoralized. He wanted to challenge us. And so, he died early in the pandemic. I was on screens of one sort or another all the time. My cynicism was probably at its highest ever, as was anxiety and all sorts of other negative experiences. And I kind of thought, well, maybe I can work on this. And Emil was a sort of North Star for this project, both an intellectual project of learning about cynicism and what we as a culture can do about it, and a personal project of seeing what I could do about my own.
Well, and I can personally attest to his quality of humanity. I had lunch with him one day right before he was diagnosed here in Ann Arbor, and I remember leaving that lunch just kind of buzzing at the energy that he had given off, and felt kind of inspired. So I envy the time that you had with him. Let's shift now, though, to what that experience ultimately led you to do, which is write a book that attempts to educate the world on what cynicism is and provide it with tools to combat it. And so we're going to go a little bit rapid fire here. Let's start with some definitions. So what is cynicism? And I'll just say, when I first read the book, I wasn't quite sure myself. Is cynicism the same as skepticism? Is it different? Is it bad? Is it good? So educate us.
Yeah, so really briefly, when I talk about cynicism, I do not mean the ancient Greek school of philosophy founded by Antisthenes and most famously represented by Diogenes. So if there are scholars of that history here, please excuse me for not talking about that. Modern cynicism, as it's defined by psychologists, you can think of as a theory about the world and about humanity in particular. It's the theory that people, at our core, are selfish, greedy, and dishonest. And this is not to say that a cynic would be shocked if somebody donated to charity or helped a friend, but they might suspect the person's motives, right? They might say, well, probably trying to get a tax break, maybe look good in public, right? So cynicism is not a theory about what people do, it's a theory about who we are. And that affects the way that you view the world and how you act in it as well.
And so you talk at length about there being certain kinds of myths that surround this concept. What are some of those?
Yeah, I think that our culture has really screwed up. I think we've glamorized this worldview as being positive in at least three ways that it's actually quite negative. The first is that we think it's smart, right? So George Bernard Shaw, for instance, wrote that the power of accurate observation is commonly called cynicism by those who haven't got it. Right? And this I hear all the time from people who are self-proclaimed cynics. They say, yeah, it doesn't feel good to suspect people, but at least I'm right. This is a form of wisdom. And even non-cynics think that. So if you present people with a story about one cynical individual and one trusting individual, you say, which one of these two people would be better at a variety of tasks? 70% of people think that cynics would be better at cognitive tasks, that they're smarter. 85% of people think that cynics would be better at socially being smart, like detecting liars, for instance. In other words, most of us put faith in people who don't have any faith in people, right? We trust them as arbiters of what people are really like, and we're all wrong. It turns out that data from hundreds of thousands of people find that cynics do less well on cognitive tests than non-cynics, and they're worse at telling people who are lying from those who are telling the truth. So we have glamorized, again, cynicism as a form of wisdom when it's actually, in many cases, quite the opposite.
And do you think that explains why it has continued to perpetuate, right? Because one would think maybe there's some adaptiveness to adopting this type of view, and if it's not adaptive, those statistics suggest we should leave it behind, and yet it stubbornly persists. And so why do you think that is?
I mean, I think that that could be one reason for it, and some evidence for this comes from data from Susan Fiske and other psychologists, where if you ask somebody, hey, appear as competent as possible, you often find that they actually act in ways that are more cynical. So for instance, they'll act less positively in conversation. They'll take out positive language from their emails to look more competent. So I do think that sometimes we actually perform cynicism or even internalize it in order to look competent. And you can imagine how that would fall on lines of identity as well. If you feel as though you really need to look competent in a given situation, you might actually become or act more cynical for that reason. But I think that another, probably larger reason that it perpetuates so much in our culture is because of the second myth that I write about, which is the idea that cynicism is safe. Right? I mean, I think a lot of us who are cynical, I mean, certainly this is true of me, are not cynical because we want to look smart, but because we've been hurt some way in the past. Right? And if you have been betrayed, let down, even traumatized in a social setting, the last thing you want to feel is that way again. And so we take, and I'm speaking as a cynic, we take all sorts of precautions.
As a current cynic or a former cynic?
Recovering.
Okay.
Noisily recovering,
Okay.
2 steps forward, 1 back, yeah. But I think that what we often do is lower our expectations as a way of feeling safe, of not setting ourselves up for betrayal again. I call this going from disappointment, which is where we lower our expectations of somebody who has let us down, to pre-disappointment, where we lower our expectations of everyone in order to never be let down again. And again, this can feel like, oh, now I'm protected. Now no one will hurt me in this way. But it's actually incredibly dangerous in the long term for our physical and mental health.
So, this is coming from someone who I think would not characterize himself as cynical. When I hear you talking about this orientation, of course I can be cynical at times, but it feels incredibly effortful. It's exhausting for me to have to carefully scrutinize people's motives and attribute wrong intentions. Is it easy for you to do that and for other cynics to do it? Is there a fit between that behavior and what you are like, or is it costly from an energy and effort perspective for everyone?
Oh, that's so interesting. I don't know if easy is the term that I would use, but for me at least, it was always quite instinctive. So it didn't seem like an extra layer of cognitive work that I had to put in. I would say that it's more, if anything, not cognitively costly, but emotionally costly, right? I mean, to not be able to trust people, again, you can feel like, oh, well, I'll never be hurt again, but you also cut yourself off from so much that people want out of life. Friendship, collaboration, and love all take the willingness to put risk in, to make ourselves vulnerable to other people. And if you're unwilling to do that, then you foreclose on the possibility for those connections.
So, any other myths you want to get into?
Yeah.
Okay.
I've got another one. A lot of people, since I've started writing about hope, write me very angry. People are really angry when you start talking about this stuff. It's very interesting.
Well, and angry because you are violating their sense of what is right and telling them that, hey, there's another path, or angry for some other reason?
I think that, well, people are angry at me for all sorts of reasons.
Well, hold on a second. You've shown me some of your fan mail. It's not all bad. We have some aspiring authors here. Right?
No, it's great. You get all sorts of emails from all sorts of people. But categories that people are angry at me include that I'm trying to take away their schema for the world. But I write back to some of those folks. I'm like, I'm right there. Read the book. I'm right there with you. But another is that people will say some version of hope. Yeah, maybe for you. You're a professor at a fancy university. Things are going great for you. You're privileged. Hope is a form of privilege. Maybe it's even toxic. A form of toxic privilege. You're ignoring the world's problems. Cynics are the ones who know how bad things are, who know about injustice, who talk about inequality. and violence, and we need to be talking about. If you're not angry, you're not paying attention, right? Which is a very fair and catchy phrase to use, but I think that, well, it's not what I think. If you look at the data, it's actually the other way around. So cynics do see, they're quite aware of real problems that we should all be aware of, but they often don't see any solutions to those problems. And if you think broken structures in our social lives, bad policies, for instance, that hurt people, or oppressive institutions, if you think that those reflect who we really are, there's nothing to be done about it. And it's actually silly to even try. So it turns out that less trusting people are less willing to vote, or less likely to vote, less likely to protest, less likely to take part in social movements, and more likely to be open to authoritarian leaders who will protect us from each other at the cost of some of our personal freedoms. So we think of cynicism as radical. In fact, it's a tool of the status quo. And if you look at the history of social activism or current activism around the world, it's driven by people who are quite angry, righteously furious about injustice, but also see hope in the goodness of their fellow citizens and the common values that we share.
So I want to come back to this angry email about, not to reactivate it too much, but this angry email about your toxic privilege as it relates to easy for you to talk about cynicism in these terms. What if you don't have the same resources, position of authority that you have? As you know, one of my favorite books, and in fact there are many students here from one of my classes, we read this favorite book of mine last week, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, where this is a book that, if you haven't read it, you should read it with Jamil's book. Maybe Jamil's first, then Viktor. Viktor's had a long run of success. So the basic premise of that book is that you can maintain hope in the face of the most devastating circumstances. And I'm wondering, when you were researching this book, beyond that anecdotal account that he described, did you come across any data that backed that up?
Oh, yeah. So first of all, definitely, Man's Search for Meaning, one of the best books ever written, in my opinion.
Along with Hope.
Chatter.
Hope for Cynics.
Yeah, along with Chatter.
Yeah.
Chatter is a close second. Yes to Life, Viktor Frankl's follow-up, is I really highly recommend as well. They're both short, so just read them back to back. Yeah, there's a bunch of data that, I mean, this goes back to psychologists have been writing about hope as a mechanism for facing adversity for over a quarter century. Richard Lazarus has a great paper from 1999 that basically stipulates that hope is not something that we experience when things are going great. It's a way of living through and dealing with our most difficult times. So a really critical distinction here is between hope and optimism, right? Optimism is the belief that the future will turn out well. Optimistic people tend to be pretty happy, but also can become kind of complacent. If everything's going to go great, no matter what you do, you can just kind of hang out and wait for that future to arrive. Optimism also can set us up for disappointment. Hope is the idea that the future could turn out well, but it's uncertain. And in that uncertainty, there's room for our actions to matter. So hopeful people, compared to optimistic folks, are more likely to try to map a path between where they are now and where they want to be, and more likely to take action to propel themselves along that path.
So let's get in with a little bit more depth into how cynicism traps us as a society.
Well, I mean, I think it traps us as individuals first through our behavior. You know, one of the things that, I guess, a central message of all of psychology is that we each live in our own version of the world, and we construct that version of the world through our beliefs and through our actions, right? So what you think about people affects how you treat them, and how you treat them affects how they react to you. So if you are cynical, if you believe the worst about people, you will do a whole bunch of stuff that you wouldn't if you felt more positively about them. I call these preemptive strikes, right? So cynics more likely to micromanage the people in their lives, more likely to spy on other people, more likely to threaten people. And it turns out other folks recognize when you're, like if you're cynical and you think it's a secret, well, I guess my cynicism was a secret to you, so I got away with it.
Totally had you duped. But I'm also I'm not cynical, so, you know.
Yeah, there you go. You were overly trusting, yeah. But I mean, if for a lot of us, if you are cynical and you're trying to protect yourself from the selfishness of other people, they know, and they don't like it. You know, people don't like to be viewed as selfish and greedy, and they often react by becoming the worst version of themselves. You know, there's a great example of this that took place in the Boston Fire Department. So around the turn of the century, a new fire chief took over, and he audited the workforce, and he found that firefighters were taking sick days more often on Mondays, but especially on Fridays, than any other day of the week. And he thought, aha, I've caught them. My workforce is a bunch of cheaters. I should say, up until that point, firefighters, because their work is extraordinarily dangerous, could take as many sick days as they wanted to. It was a nod, a vote of confidence in their service through their profession. And maybe it was 3-5% of the workforce that was taking advantage of that. But the chief decided, it's going to stop on my watch. And he decided to, in essence, punish 100% of the workforce instead. He said, now sick days will be capped at 15 per year. If you take more than that, you have to send a doctor's note in. And if you're injured on the job, you need to go before a medical board because we want to put you on desk duty. We're not going to let you just rest at home. The policy went into effect around Christmas Merry Christmas, everybody, 2001. And the number of sick days taken by the entire Boston Fire Department rose from 6,000 in 2001 to 13,000 in 2002. The number of firefighters who took exactly 15 sick days increased by 1,000%, 10 times. And so the policy cost tens of millions of dollars. It was rolled back immediately. But interviews by the Boston Globe with firefighters found that the damage was already done. These are people who were risking their lives regularly to protect their communities. And here their boss was treating them like selfish cheaters. And they said, well, if that's all I can be in your eyes, I'll just become that, right? And there are self-fulfilling prophecies like this all over our social lives that I think go undetected. And oftentimes what happens is a cynic will mistreat somebody else, bring out that person's most selfish and combative side, and then declare, I was right all along, right? As though they have found confirmatory evidence for their theory, not knowing that it was their own actions that made that theory appear to be correct.
We often hear that misery loves company. And just hearing you talk, to what extent does that speak to this phenomenon in the sense that do cynics like hanging out with cynics? Do they like hanging out, or do they like hanging out with the Emils? Or is it unclear? Oh,
that's a really interesting question. We have the data to address that, but I don't think we've run that analysis yet. I mean, we have all these data on the social networks of Stanford undergraduates, and we also record their cynicism before they come to college. So we could examine whether there's homophily, right? Whether cynics attract each other or not. I'll tell my student. I'll do that now, and by do that I mean ask one of my students to do it.
Report back next week.
Yeah, sounds good.
What about prevalence? So, how bad is the situation with respect to cynicism in this country and/or beyond?
It's getting worse. I mean, so we don't have cross-national data over time on an entire battery of cynicism questions. So the best we can do is there's the question, do you think most people can be trusted, has been asked of thousands of people around the world for many years through the World Values Survey and the General Social Survey here in the US. And those data are pretty sad to look at. So in 1972, about half of Americans believed that most people can be trusted. By 2018, that had fallen to a third of Americans. And that's a drop as big as the stock market took during the financial crash of 2008. So we're living through a national trust deficit. It's a very quiet crisis, but it's happening. And around the world, we have less longitudinal data, but a 2022 survey of 28 countries found that in 24 of those countries, most people said that their default was to mistrust others, people in general. So if you take that as an index, it's pretty bad.
Certainly not going in the right direction.
No.
So we'll have to see how it changes following last Tuesday.
The publication of Hope for Cynics, a watershed moment. Yes,
of
course.
That's right. That's right. We'll be documenting that.
People will be writing about it for years.
To a journal near you. Just to close out this section on what cynicism is, nuts and bolts, if you had to just succinctly frame for us what is at stake in your view when you think about cynicism in society, what's your answer to that question?
It's a poison, right? I mean, it hurts us at basically every level psychologists, economists, and social scientists can measure. Cynics tend to suffer over the course of their life from more issues with their mental health, depression, loneliness, but also issues with their physical health, everything from diabetes to heart disease to cellular aging. Cynics die younger than non-cynics. This is from large prospective cohort studies. They also have worse relationships, earn less money over the course of their careers. It's pretty bad. You know, maybe the most famous single line on cynicism comes from the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who said that we need a tight rein from our government because left to our own devices, human life is nasty, brutish, and short. But I think that might best capture the lives of cynics themselves, right, more than humanity as a whole. So it hurts us. And again, I'm speaking from experience here. It also hurts our communities, everything from families to organizations. We saw that with the firefighters example, to cultures. So nations that are less trusting grow less quickly economically or stagnate or shrink compared to their more trusting nations. And more trusting nations also have greater civic engagement, pro-social behavior, mental health. So really at every level that we can measure, cynicism is not just on the rise, but it's also hurting us.
Yeah, I mean, just hearing you talk about it, what I can't wrap my head around is given these incredible negative consequences linked with it, we still find that it persists. And so teach us, how do we combat this if we ourselves find ourselves cynical? And equally important, what are the tools that we can use to help those that we care about be less cynical?
Yeah. Thanks for. Sorry for this has been so gloomy so far. Really apologize.
You've brought me down big time.
Yeah. So maybe we can move from the third word in the title to the first, right? From cynicism to hope. So a really surprising thing for me is that spending the last 3-4 years marinating myself in the science of mistrust, suspicion, and hopelessness has actually made me feel a lot better about humanity. So shockingly, because I've learned that cynicism often is not just harmful, but is simply mistaken. That the data are pretty clear that people in general are more trustworthy, more generous, more open-minded, and friendlier than we realize, which is not at all to say that there aren't people doing terrible things all the time. Of course there are, all around the world. But the average person underestimates the average person. And what that means is that, in essence, our biases to see the worst in people and to fear the worst in social situations have driven us to a version of the world that's very different than what's actually out there. What that further means is that being more hopeful and cultivating greater faith in people is not a matter of looking away from who we really are, but rather looking more closely, paying closer attention to the evidence, whether that's scientific evidence in my case, or just the evidence in front of us, in the people who are actually around us.
And so you break down in the book that there are different ways of being super tactical with respect to how to go from the cynical view or mindset to the more skeptical view and the more hopeful view. Let's just, rapid fire go through some of those very pragmatic tools that people can start using, not while we're listening to Jamil talk, but as soon as you leave, if you're so inclined.
Yeah,
let's start maybe with like shifting your mindset.
Yeah. So the mindset that I offer in the book as an alternative to cynicism is hopeful skepticism. So again, skepticism and cynicism, not the same, right? Cynicism is this blanket assumption about what people are like that actually stops us from paying close attention, right? It's like you can imagine cynics as being sort of like lawyers in the prosecution against humanity, right? They look for evidence that matches their expectations and ignore or explain away whatever doesn't match their expectations. If that's what a cynic is, then a skeptic is not like a lawyer at all. They're more like a scientist, open to evidence, hungry for information, wanting to not have one blanket assumption about people, but learn from each situation that they're in. A hopeful skeptic further understands that our default settings, our factory settings, are too negative, such that when they pay closer attention, pleasant surprises will be everywhere. Now, if you want to cultivate that mindset, there's a few steps that you can take. And again, I really want to lean on this idea of trying to be a little bit more like scientists and a little bit less like lawyers. The first is to be skeptical of our cynicism. So I do this all the time because I still feel cynical a lot of the time. If I meet somebody and I feel myself suspicious of them for no reason at all, if I'm burnt out and everybody's email, except for Ethan's, feel like a huge burden, like people are just taking from me, I say, wait a minute, Zaki, you are literally a scientist. If you were making this, if this thought that is coming up in your mind was a scientific claim, how would you support it? What evidence do you have for this? And very often, I have to admit, I have no evidence whatsoever. So the second step then, after challenging our own cynical thoughts, is to try to gather better evidence. This entails what I call taking leaps of faith on other people, small, calculated risks that allow others, give them a chance to show us who they are. And this can be really frightening for a lot of us, anxious people among us especially. But again, the data are super clear that when people imagine what it will be like to strike up a conversation with a stranger, disclose something that they're going through to a friend, express gratitude, give someone a compliment, talk with someone you disagree with. There's data on all of this, that in each one of those cases, we underestimate how positive and fulfilling those experiences will be. So when we put some faith in other people, we don't just get a chance to learn from them and become more accurate, we also, in almost every case, end up with better data in that the data are more accurate and also that they're more positive.
Tell us about the reciprocity mindset.
Yeah, so this is, again, this idea of self-fulfilling prophecies that oftentimes the way that we treat people change who they become. You know, I often think about Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. I feel like we're all surrounded by Heisenberg's friends and colleagues. You know, they sort of will become whatever, in a way, they'll become what we imagine them to be.
And maybe just tell the folks who haven't taken our class about that principle.
Oh, about the Heisenberg principle? Well,
Yeah.
This is the idea that when you observe the physical world, you change it in some way. And I think you change the social world when you observe it too. And so a reciprocity mindset is simply understanding that. The way you treat people will change who they become in your presence. And so in my lab, we taught some people this, and we said, hey, you know, when you mistrust others, they tend to become less trustworthy, and when you trust them, they tend to step up and meet those expectations. This is what economists call earned trust. And we found that simply explaining this concept to people made them more willing to trust others in economic games and in conversations. And in both cases, when people trusted, the people they were interacting with did become more trustworthy. So this reciprocity mindset can allow us to turn toxic self-fulfilling prophecies into virtuous ones.
You know, and I realize so much of this is early goings, and so there may not be data on this, but I'm wondering how enduring the shifts you get from some of these micro-interventions are, in the following sense. Let's say I'm a cynic, I do some of these practices, I'm moving in the positive direction, but then I get burned.
Yeah.
Do I relapse, and how powerful is that relapse?
Yeah, you're right that there aren't very good data on this. I do think, you know, when I think about long-term impacts of some of these techniques, I do think that a lot of them are really quite grounded in CBT, right? Cognitive behavioral therapy, which involves trying to reframe, challenge, and challenge our negative patterns of thought, and then replace them with more adaptive ones. And I think of cynicism a little bit as a social form of depression, right? If depression involves all sorts of negative thoughts about ourselves that cause us to withdraw and then make things worse, cynicism involves negative thoughts about other people that cause us to withdraw from them and make our social lives worse. So I do think that, in CBT, we see that regularly practicing these reframes can be quite powerful.
That's a great segue to talk about culture, because you spend some time talking about how shifts in culture can also be a pretty powerful lever for having individual change, but really from the kind of outside in. So you want to talk a little bit about that? And we have a little bit of time, but not a whole lot. So
speed it up.
Maybe a little.
A little auctioneer speak. Okay. I think we
too fast.
When people don't trust others, they micromanage them, as you can see. So
that was harsh. We didn't rehearse that one.
We've got the history for it.
That's
it's okay.
right.
We can handle it. As individuals, we have the chance to collect better data ourselves in our own lives. As leaders, we have the chance to give other people better data. We've done this at Stanford, so it turns out that Stanford undergraduates underestimate how much their peers want to connect with them. If we ask people, how much do you want to make friends, and how do you think the average Stanford student would answer that, we get two completely different realities. Students are desperate to connect with one another, but they don't realize that all their peers around them want the same thing. And the more that they underestimate their peers, the less that they take social risks, leaps of faith, and then the lonelier that they end up months later. So we ran an advertising campaign at Stanford where the target audience was Stanford undergraduates, and the product was also Stanford undergraduates. We targeted some dorms and put posters up simply showing students the actual data about what their peers said. And then we did some psychoeducation as well, where we brought them in and tested their expectations and challenged them with data. And the students in those dorms were more accurate about what their peers wanted. They were more willing to take social risks, and 6 months later, they had a broader social network than people who had not received that intervention. So as leaders, we're able to collect and share real information. So much of what I've learned is that cynicism hurts us, but the way that it hurts us is totally preventable, because all we have to do to counteract it is to just, again, understand each other more clearly. And so anyone in a leadership position has the possibility, the power, to give people better information about each other and help them discover what probably is a lot of common ground in terms of what they want.
And when do you think this starts, this kind of miscalibration about what other people are hoping for and desiring? Is that something that comes online later? Do you know anything about the developmental roots? Should I be telling my daughter's 5th grade teacher to read your book?
I think that a lot of this under-sociality work, from Nick Epley and others, which finds that people's forecasts about the social world are too negative, is all done on adults. I don't know that there's that much. There's some great developmental psychologists here, so I could be wrong, but I don't know about a lot of work looking at this in children. I would say that this is pure speculation, but I think a lot of this probably gets worse when you go online in whatever capacity, right? The representations that we have of terrible social interactions, of people getting, trolled and canceled or whatever, just the risks that we see of how badly social interaction can go escalate a lot when we go online.
Well, we can.
That's another conversation.
Right, that's another one, and Felix is here. We can talk to Felix later on about the developmental story.
Yeah.
Tell us about this term that I absolutely love, positive gossiping.
Yeah, so this is the idea that our minds tend to be calibrated too negatively, but so does our speech, right? People love going around giving 1-star Yelp reviews to the human species, right? And in my lab, we found that people gossip 3 times more about somebody who acts selfishly than about somebody who acts in a generous and trustworthy manner. I do this with my kids too, right? If I'm driving them to school and one person cuts me off in traffic, they learn all about that person's life, their values, their childhood, but they learn nothing about the 1,000 motorists who are doing just fine, being polite and following traffic laws. So I think that one way that we can counteract that is to share more accurately. And I call this positive gossip. So trying to find examples of people acting in kind, generous, or open-minded ways, and then sharing that information with other people, which I think has at least two positive consequences. One, it can balance out what other people think and counteract their cynicism. But two, when you need to share something, you notice it more. So if you decide to talk about one positive thing that you see every day, you will look more for positive things in your life, and they'll be really easy to find.
And you think that can become automated over time?
Yeah, I think it can become a habit. It has been for me.
That was a test to see how hopeful you are. All right, so you're familiar with the idea of Solomon's paradox.
From your work, yes.
This notion that we are often much better at giving advice than following it ourselves. And so several years after you have bathed yourself in the data, wrote the book, rewrote the book, and then did that a few more times, I'm curious where you stand right now on the cynicism scale. How much have you shifted? How diligent are you at implementing these practices in your own life? How cynical are you becoming when you regress?
Yeah, I mean, this is a shift that has taken me a long time, and it's ongoing work. I mean, I am by no means, cured of my cynicism at all. But I do feel that there have been several systematic changes in the way that, in my habits, right? I mean, I guess I understand that this is an uphill climb for me. I think it's an uphill climb for many of us, but I know that's true of myself. So what do I try to do? Well, I take a lot of inspiration from the nun and author Pema Chodron, who writes that we can treat our lives a little bit more like an experiment. So I've really been trying to do that. I mean, in the book I write about this, I've challenged myself to change my habits of mind, of action, and of speech. And I think I've succeeded in making those changes, right? So when I still feel cynicism coming on quite a bit, but I'm much more aware of it than I used to be. It's easier for me to hit the pause button on my inner chatter and question what's happening in my mind, to contemplate it. I do take many more leaps of faith on people, and I think that's come from me, or one way that comes out is that I now complain a lot more than I used to. You don't have to know me as well for me to be really negative around you. I know that's an ironic way for a decrease in cynicism to show up, but it's true. I feel like the more that I've trusted people, the more I've felt safe being authentic around them, and the less that I've felt like I need to perform this rigid positivity all the time. And I think it's changed my parenting quite a bit. I really do try to help my kids savor the goodness of other people, and they're better at it than I ever was. So it's not hard work, but it's really wonderful.
I mean, that sounds liberating, what you've just described.
I guess it is. Yeah, I hadn't thought about those terms, but I like that. Yeah. And I will say, I do get angry emails, but I get a lot of happy emails too, or even more, emails of people who resonate. And I think that's actually been helping my cynicism so much, to see that this is an experience that we're having together. Cynicism has eaten up a lot of our culture, but I don't think people want that. I think that we are awakening to the fact that this is not a worldview that we need to hold on to, and it's one that would be actually better if we could let it go.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much, Jamil, for this wonderful conversation.
I wonder, Ethan, if I could be so bold as to ask each of you a question. You're both psychologists, but I know that you both are called on quite often to speak to leaders, to do executive education, to advise organizations about how to make organizational environments more hopeful, more full of empathy, better for people's lives overall, and to help people do good work and lead a good life. And so could we have, since we have about 2 to 3 minutes of airtime left here, just your thoughts in conclusion about the organizational world and how your work might speak to people in our audience who are particularly oriented toward work or organizational leadership?
Well, I'm happy to start. I think it's easy to think about the organizational world as separate from the personal world, but there are no neural networks in our brain that correspond to work and person. It all mixes together, and I would say that everything that Jamil has talked about today regarding the mindsets that we bring to social interactions, they apply to our interactions with other human beings wherever we go, at work or in our home. And so we spend more time at work than we do with our families and our friends, much, much more. And so in many ways, I think you can make the argument that the principles that Jamil is speaking to couldn't be more relevant to work life than really anything else.
Yeah, just co-sign that. There's evidence that the places that we work, the organizations that we're in, the environments in which we work shape us as human beings over the long term. So yes, we spend a ton of time at work, and over the course of years, we become different versions of ourselves depending on what type of workplace we have. So there's research that finds that if a leader runs a very cynical, low-trust workplace, the people in that workplace will trust each other less, but they'll also become less trusting in their entire lives in ways that can affect their family and our culture writ large. If a leader runs an organization that is built on trust and connection, the opposite can happen. So the power of a leader, not just to get people to accomplish tasks, but to shape them into various versions of themselves, I think can't be overstated.
And I just want to punctuate one thing that Jamil just said, because so much of our conversation was about combating cynicism in ourselves. What you just spoke about is equally important, right? And it's a key facet of leadership. This is about regulating ourselves on this way, but also we all have the opportunity to regulate others and help others on this dimension. And you just, right there, you've got a playbook for how to do it.
So, this is the book, Hope for Cynics. Please read it. And the Center for Positive Organization runs a co-learning consortium. We will be doing a collective read and discussion of the book. So if you would like to join us, please check out that consortium community as a space to come together and continue the fabulous learning. Let's thank Jamil and Ethan once more.